Hi again, death penalty students. In the last video, I talked about retribution. So you know that theoretically the death penalty is about justice, right? Getting justice for crime victims. And we said it doesn't really do that good of a job because we don't use it very much. But the second reason we use the death penalty is for crime prevention, try to reduce murder. And so there's two different justifications here. The first one I'll just mention because there's not anything in the slides. It's called incapacitation. Incapacitation means taking your freedom away so you can't commit another crime. When we think about incapacitation, we think about things like prison and jail. That's your typical form, right? We remove your freedom so you can't commit crime in the free world. The death penalty is the ultimate form of incapacitation. We literally take your freedom away forever. Now, do you believe in reincarnation? If you do, maybe the death penalty does not actually incapacitate murderers. In other words, like someone commits a murder, they get executed, they come back and have another chance at life. But if you don't believe in retribution, you acknowledge that the death penalty incapacitates offenders. They're dead, and there's no way they can do it again. No one could argue that. Now, as a policy, we do it so rarely that it doesn't serve a large incapacitative effect, right? It's just not something that's possible because we don't use it very much. So it's not going to reduce murder since we're not using it, right? Deterrence is a similar thing, but you'll see on the slides about deterrence that there's two types of deterrence. There's special or specific deterrence, and there's general deterrence. And they're exactly like what they say. Special or specific deterrence is specific to one person. The idea that if you punish someone, then they'll be afraid of doing it again, and so they won't commit crime in the future. General deterrence is more general than that. It's arguing that if you carry out an execution, it serves as an example to other potential murderers that, hey, this is what can happen to you if you do it. And so if you see someone executed or you learn about someone being executed, maybe you won't commit murder. Now, we know that the death penalty is not a specific deterrent. You will see people say that, even scholars. That's not true. If an offender is dead from their punishment, they can't be afraid of committing another crime because they're dead, right? So they're not deterred. What they are is incapacitated. That's what they mean. So the only question is whether the death penalty is a general deterrent. That is, does it create fear in would-be murderers so that murderers don't commit murder? Would-be murderers don't commit murder. Here's the logic of it. Look, it makes sense, right? That the ultimate punishment should deter the ultimate crime. How do you stop a dog from peeing on the floor? Some people hit it with a newspaper, right? How do you stop a cat from clawing on your furniture? Some people swat the cat, right? How do you stop a child from being bad? Many people spank their children. So logically, punishment should work, right? We should be afraid of being killed by the government for committing a murder. But just because it's logical doesn't mean it's true. But we assume that animals learn through punishment, just like we assume people do too. And so you should be deterred, right? Here are the assumptions of deterrence. So this is on slide number 5, if you're checking that out. The logic of deterrence assumes that people are pleasure seeking. We call it hedonism. Okay? And that people are rational, which means they plan their behaviors in advance. We also assume people want to avoid pain, such as punishment. This is what deterrence comes in. So you have a rational person seeking pleasure who wants to avoid pain. The thought of death should be deterring, right? So you might get some pleasure or benefit out of murder, some kind of hedonism. But if you're rational, it's not going to be worth being killed for. So the thought of death should deter, right? But just because it's logical, again, doesn't mean it's actually deterrent. What does the evidence say? It's not very good. Here are some quotes from supporters of the death penalty. Now, some of these are people that you're reading and some of them aren't, okay? One says, we must conclude that we lack strong statistical evidence that capital punishment deters. There's no such evidence for non-deterrence either. The statistics are simply inconclusive. So isn't that interesting? You have a supporter saying, well, we don't know that it deters, but we don't know that it doesn't, so we might as well assume it does. You have another one saying statistics have not proved conclusively that the death penalty does or does not deter. So they're just assuming it does. Right? But when you ask the experts, the people who study criminology for a living and the people who lead the organizations in criminology for a living and the people who study capital punishment for a living, they all overwhelmingly say the death penalty is not a deterrent. Now, does it really matter? Historically, deterrence was a major reason cited in public opinion polls as to why people supported the death penalty. But recently, it's not widely supported, so maybe they know the truth, that it's not really considered a deterrent anymore. So remember some key facts again, just like we did with the video on retribution. Only about 2% of aggravated murderers, these are in death penalty states. 2.2% roughly of people in death penalty states are sentenced to death. How could it be a deterrent if the odds that you're going to get it are only 2%? So you're like, you mean I can kill this person who I really hate? I can really satisfy my whatever desire to kill this person, and there's only a 2% chance I'm going to be sentenced to death, and then I'm going to sit on death row for 20 years, and I might at that point be executed? That seems pretty hard to imagine that that would be a deterrent, right? So here's why it matters. For punishment to deter, it has to be certain. This is called the certainty of punishment. It has to be likely to happen. It has to be severe enough only to outweigh the pleasure. And it has to be swift, it has to be fast. Well, the death penalty is not certain. It's not severe. It's not fast either. But of those three elements, certainty is considered the most important, and we have study after study after study after study after study for decades showing this generally to be true, that what matters most is the likelihood of getting punished, okay? And the death penalty is not, so how could it be a deterrent? It's not logical to assume it would be, but it's so rare. So here's what you'll see in your PowerPoint slideshow, and there's a discussion of this in the Death Penalty Information Center readings as well. The studies compare states with the death penalty and states without. They study nations with the death penalty and nations without. They study jurisdictions before they have the death penalty or after, before they abolish it, after it, that sort of thing. And they study the effects of highly publicized executions. What would you expect to find in these studies? You would expect states with the death penalty would have lower murder rates, right? But that's not what we find. You'd expect nations with the death penalty to have lower murder rates, but that's not what we find. You would expect that, like, when a state abolishes the death penalty, murder goes up, but that's not what we found. Consider North Carolina. Remember from earlier in the class, the number of death sentences in North Carolina from the 90s to the 2000s fell faster than any state in the country. What happened to our murder rate? It fell to its lowest level ever. This is the opposite of what you'd expect, right? You see the effects of a highly publicized execution either show no effects or actually show what's called a brutalization effect. Brutalization means like you're brutalized by the knowledge that the government has carried on execution. So what we see in some studies is a small increase in murders right after an execution. That's called brutalization. But the point is, what we see is no consistent evidence of deterrence in research, and more evidence of brutalization, although I'm very skeptical about that. So you'll see some slides about states with the death penalty and states without. You'll see some really good numbers there. You notice that the South has the death penalty the most, and they also have the highest murder rate. So this is data from 2014. Okay. The Northeast has no executions, and they have the lowest murder rate. You see some figures that are really cool. So slides 14 and 15, I believe, of your slideshow show you the average of murder rates comparing death penalty states and non-death penalty states. And you see they're just consistently higher. Now look, this might have nothing to do with deterrence. Maybe the reason these states have more executions is because they have more murder. That makes sense, right? But you'd still expect some kind of downward trend in murders if states are executing. And what we see with murder trends is that murder trends tend to go down in the United States in states with the death penalty and states without the death penalty. And murder rates tend to go up in states with the death penalty and states without the death penalty. So this suggests that whether murder goes down or up has nothing to do with the death penalty, which is what you should expect because it's so rare, right? It's not certain, it's not imposed at a high certainty or high likelihood. So it really shouldn't have an effect. That's what we find. There's also some stuff about nations. It's harder to compare nations because they have different populations, different traditions, different customs, different histories. But we have way more murder, particularly gun murder, than other places around the world, especially our allies, countries like us. We have the death penalty, they don't. So all of Europe has abolished the death penalty. The United States has not. Canada has abolished the death penalty. The United States has not. So, all of our allies and people around us have abolished it. The United States has not. So here's a summary of the evidence. There are no studies considered valid today that show evidence of deterrence. You're going to see people cite that study by Isaac Ehrlich from 1975 that found that every execution prevented 7 to 8 murders. Now, I would ask you, how would you know if a punishment eliminated 7 to 8 murders? Those 7 to 8 murders didn't happen. So how do you know that they were prevented? How do you know they were going to happen unless they happened? Seems kind of interesting, doesn't it? The study was replicated by other scholars, which is the heart of science, replicating studies to see if they're true. They found no effect of executions on murder. The study is so plagued by flaws that the National Academy of Sciences, the highest scientific body in the United States, did not accept his findings. Okay. Now, Dr. Robert Bohm is a friend of mine. He just retired as a criminologist from University of Central Florida. I highly recommend his book, Death Quest. Any edition of it, but particularly the most recent one, Death Quest. He wrote, with the exception of a handful of thoroughly discredited analysis or the few newer studies that have not been subjected to rigorous examination, no evidence exists of deterrence. Well, fewer new studies? I looked at those in my book called Death Nation, which is where I surveyed the experts of the death penalty. You'll see their findings on deterrence here in a minute in this slideshow, in this video. Here's what I wrote in that book. Economic studies. These are studies not by criminologists, by economists, okay? They find each execution results in 3 fewer murders, or 5 fewer murders, or between 3 and 25 fewer murders with an average of 14, or between 8 and 28 murders with an average of 18, and even 150 fewer murders. Now, these studies suffered from major flaws. People replicated them and found opposite findings. You can read about it there on the Death Penalty Information Center. There's a link on your slideshow when you pull it up, slide number 21. Okay. So when supporters are confronted with this evidence, they say things like you already saw. It's the best bet hypothesis. The best bet hypothesis says if we do not know if the death penalty is a deterrent, we should bet that it is. If there's no evidence that it's not, we should bet that it is. This is a really interesting argument. Here's what they say. It would be better to assume there is a deterrent when there's not and use the death penalty. The only thing that you would get, so if the death penalty was not a deterrent, but you assumed it was, the only thing you get is dead murders. What's the problem with that? That's better than assuming that there's not a deterrent when there is. If there is a deterrent and you don't use it, you're getting more murder. See, the best bet hypothesis says, I'd rather have dead murderers and no deterrent than dead murder victims when there would have been a deterrent. Okay. It certainly makes sense. We just don't have any evidence of deterrence. They also talk about the anecdotal evidence. You'll see supporters regularly provide individual cases where someone says that they were deterred. I'm sure that exists, absolutely. We do have examples of that. But think of your typical murderer. Someone is killing in the heat of the moment. Someone is going to feel really good about this murder they're about to commit. They're doing it for financial gain. They're doing it because their spouse cheated on them. They're doing it because someone called their mom a bad name. They're doing it because someone cut them off on the road, whatever, someone bumped into them at a bar, they haul off and lose it. They're not even thinking about the death penalty in this case. I mean, it's illogical to even assume, particularly if they're under the influence of alcohol. So I would like to look at expert opinions. We have a survey of presidents of the American Society of Criminology, the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, and the Law and Society Association. These are the elite of the elite in criminology, basically. 84% say the death penalty is not a deterrent. 93% say the threat of the death penalty is not a greater deterrent than just a long prison term. which is really the issue. It's not really an issue of whether the death penalty deters. It's whether it deters more than prison. These people say no. 87% say abolishing the death penalty would have no significant effects on the murder rate. And look, 0% said the death penalty significantly reduces homicide, whereas 100% said politicians support the death penalty to appear tough on crime. You can continue reading on, but you get the point, right? The experts, these are not necessarily people that study the death penalty, but these are people that lead major criminological organizations. So they're elected to these positions by all criminologists and criminal justice professors and things. That suggests that we think they know what they're talking about, right? There was also a survey of fellows of the American Society of Criminology. These are permanent members, winners of the Sutherland Award. This is the highest award given out by the American Society of Criminology, and presidents of ASC between 1997 and 2009. These are elites, right? 88% say the death penalty is not a deterrent. 78% say the death penalty does not lower the murder rate. 90% say the death penalty has little effect on murder. 92% say killing more people would not reduce murder. 91% say politicians support the death penalty to appear tough on crime. Okay, so same kinds of questions, same kinds of answers. Now, what about my study? Here's my question. This is slide number 27. Does capital punishment as actually practiced in the United States achieve deterrence? That is, prevent future murderers by causing fear in would-be murderers so that they do not commit murder. Does it prevent future murders by causing fear in would-be murderers so they don't commit murder? 9% said yes. Okay. 9%. Now, those 9%, when we look at their answers, they weren't very certain, and they said things like, it does, but it's probably too small a measure. Just think about that. Now, the difference between my survey and the others is mine is actually a survey of people who study and write about the death penalty for a living. Okay? So it clearly does not. Little deterrence value, never has deterrent, never will. Not a superior deterrent than life without parole. Does not support the deterrence thesis. Little, if any, effect. Does not deter. No marginal deterrent effect. Okay, this is what the experts are saying. No, not the way it's carried out. No, I know of no credible studies that show it deters. Deterrence is a scientifically weak claim. Okay, lots of evidence on this. Someone said that the death penalty does not deter. To the best of my knowledge, there is not meaningful evidence that the death penalty deters murder or other crimes. Okay. No, except for incapacitation, the death penalty does not deter. And then I love this one. You can read slide number 35. Please, I can't believe anyone is still wasting time on this one, playing the game of finding that 1,000th of a statistical advantage point and getting a journal article consulting career out of it. And this is how this expert portrays a murderer. Okay. So like, imagine this is the person being sarcastic, a death penalty expert who actually wrote this, thinking like, well, this is what we would assume an actual would-be murderer would think about. So this is what they wrote. This rock is some good shit. Sorry, like crack. Must put the dealer on my dialer. Does this state have the death penalty, or should I go to Michigan to rob a convenience store, kill my ex-wife's boyfriend, cover up my other illegal activities with a little murder? Screw it, my beater of a car won't take me that far. Anyway, they'll never catch me. So she says, someone under compulsion, addiction, rage, sexual desire, jealousy, or deviance, whatever, doesn't even think they're going to get caught. The idea that they would somehow be deterred is somewhat irrational, or illogical, I should say. Now you see the people who say they're unsure. They said things like, it's not possible to measure. And then the people who said yes said, this is someone who said yes. Okay, now one person mentioned latest studies, but we talked about the flaws with those. One person wrote, at the present time, capital punishment is utilized far too infrequently to provide a strong deterrent. So in other words, there is a deterrent effect, but it is, quote, numerically quite weak. Another expert spends a lot of time saying that to say that the death penalty is not a deterrent would be to admit that potential murderers are not rational. Okay. This person says, but at the end, the effect is not large. The deterrent effect is not large enough to measure, which means it doesn't exist, right? And then another one says, I do believe the death penalty deters, but it doesn't deter better than prison. So we could use that as an alternative. Okay. So we can conclude and say, yes, the death penalty incapacitates some murders, but very few. There is no credible evidence that the death penalty deters or saves lives. In fact, the evidence seems to be the opposite of that. So when we talk about a cost-benefit analysis of the death penalty, and when we talk about a policy, the death penalty meeting its goals, you have to ask yourself, number one, does the death penalty meet its goals? Do we achieve retribution, incapacitation, and deterrence? The answer is no, because we don't use it enough. Now, you could argue then we should use it more. You'll learn when we talk about the problems of the death penalty, which is next, you'll learn why we can't use it more. Okay. So number one, the death penalty does not achieve its goals. Number two, cost-benefit analysis. The benefits of the death penalty are very, very small. Maybe a little retribution, maybe a little incapacitation, maybe a little deterrence. Put that on the scale. And then you weigh that against racial bias, the threat to the innocent, the financial cost, the burden it puts on the criminal justice system to pursue a death penalty case, these kinds of things, which we'll talk about. Most experts say, whoa, the costs vastly outweigh the benefits. So this is why the death penalty is considered a failing policy, and why experts don't support it. Okay. Now, this doesn't mean you have to change your opinion. If you support the death penalty, support it. But remember, the Marshall hypothesis says the more people learn about the death penalty, the less likely they are to support it. So maybe you will change your mind. That's not the point of the class. The point of the class is just to understand whether the death penalty meets its goals, whether the death penalty provides enough benefits, and if not, why. That's what we'll be getting into when we talk about the problems and moving on with the future, okay? All right, keep doing your readings. Go through the PowerPoint slideshows, and the next unit is on problems